We know that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. We can be fairly certain of that, considering we are now 7 days into a war that was not started by Iran, that was started by Israel and the US. And there is no way in hell that Israel or the US would have started a war with a country where one of the risks would have been that that conflict could have escalated into nuclear warfare. Israel, which is in close proximity to Iran, there is no way that Israel would have taken that risk. They would not have launched an attack on Iran. They would not have started a war. If Israel believed that Iran might have had a nuclear weapon, especially if they thought they had a nuclear weapon that they didn't know about. So they were sure they would have had that intel, and it would have probably been a condition of starting this war. One of the conditions would have been that Iran was not in possession of nuclear weapons. Israel would not have started a war with a country that was in possession of a nuclear weapon because Israel would not have started a war with a country that it could not defeat. Israel would not start a war that it would not be able to win. No country does that. No country starts a war with another country with the expectation that it will lose. The only way that a nation state will wage war on another nation is if it has the upper hand, if it has a tactical advantage, or if it has, in this case, an ally, a stronger ally. So Israel and the US planned this war. They planned this attack. They had and still have the tactical advantage because they knew that they were going to attack. They knew what to expect and they could prepare for that. They could prepare their army bases, they could prepare their troops, they could prepare their weapons, their aircraft, whatever it is that they knew that they would need. They were able to prepare in advance for that. It was not a surprise to them. The attack on Iran was not a surprise to the US. It was not a surprise to Israel. They had planned that attack. So the first strike, which came from Israel, it had to come from Israel. Between those two nations, that very first strike, which took out the Ayatollah and 40 of his chief staff. So it took out the Minister of Defense, it took out the commander, the chief commander of the IRGC, it took out the commander of the National Army, it took out their intelligence officers, it took out all of the Ayatollahs or the supreme leaders in a circle. So the head of police, the head of the Air Force, the head of the army, the head of intelligence, all of these chief officers, so key individuals, people who were pivotal to the regime, they were all taken out in the first hit before anyone had declared war. That was an ambush that came from Israel, and it had to come from them. That strike, that missile strike or that airstrike had to come from Israel. Because imagine the type of stealth, imagine the secrecy of that operation for Israel to pull that off so cleanly. If they had launched an attack and missed the target, then the leadership of the regime would have known, they would have retaliated, they would have escaped, it would have been messy, it would have been a botched mission, and the war probably would never have gone ahead, at least not with any degree of success. It had to happen this way. So there was no room for error. That had to be an extremely precise attack. And that had to come from a plane or from a fighter jet coming from Israel. That is like a 2-hour flight. It requires stealth, it requires precision. So that aircraft would have had to fly into Iranian airspace undetected. It would have had to launch its attack, not miss, but also not take out anything that would have been unnecessary, not for that first attack. There is an aerial shot that was taken of the compound where the Ayatollah and his senior staff, so all of these officials who served the regime, they were all in this compound together, and that compound was taken out completely, like wiped out. But the surroundings are all intact, and that's important for the first attack. It was important that they could take that shot, as in that they could take that photo as evidence that that was a target. It was a clean target. Because as we know, a school that was very close to one of the intended targets, that school was also bombed. And the civilians or the children that went to that school were obviously killed. And that is not a good look for any nation, but particularly not at the beginning of a war, because then it doesn't look like it is a war. It looks like an occupation, or it looks like an act of terror. So the precision of that attack, that had to come from Israel. But on the very first day, the US, within an hour, Trump had declared war, and the US started sending over their military aircraft, their fighter jets. They dropped 1,000 bombs on Iran on the first day. 900 targets were hit within the first 12 hours of declaring war on Iran. This is a country that did not know it was about to go into war. This is a country that had no internet. It still has no internet. So the internet had been cut. So they were already at a severe disadvantage, not to mention that most of the population was suffering from drought, from famine, from economic hardship brought on by the US and brought on by the rest of the international community. So their currency had been hit hard, which was intentional. That was an intentional tactic by the US to destabilize Iran in the hope that the regime would then either be forced to reconcile with the US or be forced to begin negotiations to force the regime leaders into compliance.